a human being can't see inside a pill. And so I thought about this project, started working on it about 8 years ago, and we developed a little paper card. So there's an example up here, and if you want to roll that video, the drug is just smeared across the top of the card, and then you dip the bottom in water, and the card does 12 different color tests, and it generates a sort of a barcode. So a person can evaluate the drug and at least detect the worst of the worst products. And the reason that that's a help is that if you can find the worst quality products out there and move them to the front of the queue for analysis, then it's possible to catch the makers who are producing these bad quality products. And the real problem is that there's somewhere out there, there's a big company that's doing this, and we still don't know who they are. They're still doing it. And often when drug regulatory agencies collect products from the market, it takes so long for them to get into analysis that by the time they find a bad quality product, the stuff that's in the market has already been sold or given to patients. And so we're trying to create a new way to do dynamic sampling and to work to implement this technology in low and middle income countries. So I partner with people in Tanzania, for example. We did a big study recently. We had 20 inspectors from the Tanzanian Drug Regulatory Agency. We trained them in how to use the card, took about an hour and a half, and then we sent them 3,000 samples that were blinded. They didn't know if they were good amoxicillin or bad amoxicillin, and they were able to pick out 93% of the good quality stuff and 93% of the bad quality stuff. So it's pretty good accuracy for the card, and we're really interested in pursuing this technology, pursuing it towards implementation in many low and middle income countries. So the card is just a piece of the system that needs to be in place for finding fake medicines. And I want, maybe I can pass along, is that, okay.
That's cool. So I'm a scientist, but I'm going to talk about a business model on how to invent new medicines and make them affordable. And so all around the world, as you know, society's investing hundreds of billions of dollars every year in biomedical research and drug discovery to make medicines and try to make them effective and try to make them less expensive. But we're not succeeding, obviously. So Parkinson lived 200 years ago. Where's the medicine? There is none. So, you know, you diagnose the problem, and over the years, I think the academic and industry system has evolved around incentives that aren't really aligned to those objectives. And try as we may, tweaking it, it won't, I think, change the system. It's too intertwined. So we started to develop a parallel universe that works to different incentives. We've been doing it, we collectively, over the past decades. It started with the Human Genome Project, and there's been a movement in biomedicine now to share more results freely, so-called open science. And the organization that I run built on this, and starting in 2003, extended this open science ethos from genes to proteins to actually now early stage drug discovery. And so it's really kind of fun to see the academic community and industry community commit to sharing. Over the years now, thousands of scientists in academia of industry have pooled together their ideas and resources to put stuff in the public domain without patents so that the knowledge can flow more quickly and opportunities can emerge more quickly. And parenthetically, that leads to more open science, more transparent science, more reproducible science. From these sort of open, as it were, playground has emerged discoveries that have gone into, I think now it's well over 50 clinical trials. 10 companies have emerged from the knowledge that's gone up. Industry's invested into our organization alone $200 million to put stuff into the public domain without patents. So there's a lot of evidence that open science works well in the discovery process, but that's not helping make affordable medicines. So about a year ago, we started a company called M4K Pharma. It stands for Meds for Kids Pharma, to try and treat very rare and always fatal children's brain cancer. It shares the science as we go along. Every month we have a YouTube and we put all our chemistry online to create prior art, as it were, to stop other people from patenting. The business protects its marketing rights using a clever use of regulatory data. We don't need patents. And because the company we structured to be owned entirely by a charity, we can commit to affordable pricing if we're lucky enough to make a medicine. So far, it's been really cool. The company's attracted about $4 million in donations and grants. Companies are contributing in kind of various skill sets. We're ahead of progress on the science and under budget. Indeed, it's cool folks keep offering to do experiments for us because obviously this is a collective effort to make a medicine and no one's going to profit for it. Professors love it. We raise funding, lots of collaborators, and good progress. But the question is it a one-off? Right? It's very sympathetic doing a children's brain cancer. We don't know, but we're going to find out. And so last week, the Newman Foundation in Toronto donated us $1.5 million to start a new M4 initiative, Medicines for Neurodegeneration, M4ND. It's going to do open source drug discovery, starting with Parkinson's and ALS. So I would say it's exciting times for open science. It's a popular word now, and its application to drug discovery. And I think with the practical, albeit early accomplishments of M4K, it's now, I think, possible to imagine a new drug discovery ecosystem where some of the world's funding is devoted to advanced medicines in the open, and thus with a commitment to affordable pricing. I think it's about to happen.
So I'm a cancer center director, proud to be part of a university that's a Carnegie Tier 1 research center that just happens to be minority serving institutions. But I'm going to tell you the biggest thing that keeps me awake at night isn't that we're going to have new cures or new devices. It's the truth of the matter is some will benefit while others will not. This is an example many of you have probably seen from the New York Times of many minorities who are saying, you know, we think about the craziness that's happening around immunotherapy and the promise, many minorities are not part of that. As a result of that, we are not certain how these drugs will actually work on all populations. The interesting thing about that is that in my neighborhood, within a 5-mile radius, I have a life expectancy difference of 16 years. Now, what that means is that you can get on the train, the L train, we call it in Chicago, and literally within 5 stops have a decrease in 16 to 17 years of life expectancy. So as we think about clinical trials, we're not only thinking about just access to regular medicine, the truth of the matter is the lack of attention to not only the discovery sciences, but the implementation sciences will undoubtedly benefit some, but not many. And the truth of the matter is, my worry is that the Gold Coast, which has a life expectancy of 85. This is work done by Dr. David and others from Ansel and others from Rush. But my worry isn't that the 85 is going to go to 90 in the next several years. My worry is that a neighborhood, which is roughly about 8 miles away, something called West Garfield Park, will still remain at the 68, 69 life expectancy where they are now. And so our miracle drugs and our promise to the rest of America and the rest of the United States of making sure that these new technologies, these new devices benefit us all, may inadvertently actually widen our disparities. So one of the things we're going to be talking about that I'm focused on is not only having miracle drugs in clinical trials, but who's on those clinical trials. I'll end with sort of saying that many times the same people that we really are trying to actually have the biggest impact on aren't even allowed in these trials because we haven't even dealt with the issue that most human beings actually live with comorbidities. And yet we have actually done nothing around in vivo modeling or even any other modeling for that matter in trying to overcome this issue about who could benefit from clinical trials independent of comorbidities. So I'll stop there because that probably caused enough trouble. So.
Great. All right. Thank you so much. We'll open the floor to questions. Mike is coming to you. Kindly state your name and affiliation before your question. And our first is right here. Okay.
Tom Keenan from Business Edge in Canada. I guess it's really a question for Aled. You mentioned sort of very tangentially clever regulatory ideas. And regulation varies quite a bit around the world from very strict to none. So how's that going to play out?
What happens is that when one has a new medicine and one has to put it through the regulatory process, One has to convince the regulators of the safety and ultimately the efficacy of the medicine. That is compiled within a database, like a big file that you literally submit to the regulators. The Hatch-Waxman Act said once that drug is approved, those data belong, as much as the patent belongs to me, those data belong to me. And I won't go into, I mean, you can go into the details, but in essence, the generics can't enter the market without being able to look at your data. And in the big jurisdictions of the world, America, European Union, Japan, nobody cares about Canada, FYI. The time of exclusivity can range from 7 to 12 to 14 years, which is on average the time of your patent life left. Customarily, a drug discoverer will get both, the patent and this. We just decided to forsake the patent and just go with the regulatory data, which are in reality a stronger disincentive to competition. It keeps them away better.
Okay. Question up here.
Hi, Clive Cookson from the Financial Times. I wanted to ask Marya more about how the card was developed, who did the R&D for it.
So the technique of making paper analytical devices was developed by George Whitesides. The application, that was me and my group. So we combined chemical color tests, which are the techniques that people used to use to determine what functional groups were present in a molecule before the age of spectroscopy. So we read a lot of old scientific literature, and yeah. Does that help? Yeah.
And how much does it cost once it's in full production, or now that it's in full production? And how many drugs do you have test cards for?
So this one test card will detect 70 active ingredients and fillers. So we also have tests on there for cutting agents that might be added to adulterate a drug. The cost to manufacture that, for me, making them in my lab with my lab tech, is 45 cents a card. So when it goes into production, if it goes onto a newspaper type, or what used to be a newspaper type printing press, a reel-to-reel process, that would probably come down. But.
So another question for you, which is in the 2000s, we were told that things like RFID would really help on the counterfeit drug and better supply chain management. And I would like to know if any of that happened.
May we have your affiliation? Yeah.
Oh, Simpson Garfingal, I write for Technology Review magazine.
Thank you.
So in the United States, there's a process called track and trace. So every package of medicine, you can track where it came from in the supply chain. And that's a huge help if there's a problem. And also in the US, we have a very strong system for detecting unintended effects. So if a person takes a medicine and they go into a coma or something, there's a really bad side effect, then the CDC can be on that really fast. In many low and middle income countries, that regulatory infrastructure hasn't been developed. They're undeveloped countries, and part of what they haven't developed is that full functionality of a regulatory system. And so track and trace will be a big help, but there are thousands of manufacturers, and not all of them are good actors in this system.
While we wait for our next question, Dr. Winn, I think at your cancer center, have you been making some progress in changing the way that people get involved in clinical trials? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's been kind of a cool experiment, if you will. We've actually, gotten beyond using precision medicine as a tagline, and knowing that beyond the individual, we have not been collecting precise data around communities. So we have now gone about literally figuring out smart data, as we call it, and with those smart data, deploying people within the community and people from our universities to have different types of conversations, to get more people to buy into sort of having the trust, but knowing that clinical trials, particularly in African American Latino communities, typically meant that you're being experimented on as opposed that you're actually getting better care. The reality is, if we're going to develop really new drugs, we really have to be thinking about all populations in the context of precision medicine. It's amazing how blind we are to the precision and the data that's actually needed to do it. As a result of that, I'm happy to report to you that we've more than tripled the people on our clinical trials. 63% of them are actually African, 2/3 are African American, and the rest are made up of other minorities, because there is a level of trust and there's been a communication that we're not experimenting, we are actually giving you better care, and then we have the data to back that up. I think that that's an important thing as we move forward, because the saddest thing would be that if, again, the richest neighborhoods go from 85 in Chicago to 90, and the not so well neighborhoods, who, by the way, actually carry the burden of cancer disease, don't improve. That would not be a forward progress of science. I think that'd be actually a step backwards.
But how do you, just to elaborate on that, how do you build that trust and get that participation? What does that look like?
So we did something that would probably be completely unusual, unheard of, and probably in today's world, you would say, this makes no sense. But the very first thing is we changed the way we collected data, and we collected data around what people knew and understood around a geopolitical map. Now, you would say, why would you do that? Because the politicians are not going to be, right? That's actually wrong. The truth of the matter is, when presented with the appropriate data, they have been tremendous partners in being able to actually work with us in getting community hospitals and others involved with demystifying what we're doing around clinical trials. And so, again, I feel like Henry Ford every time I come to a solar science conference, right? I mean, we know that, Benz is the one who created the first combustible engine, but it really is, the big impact is how do you get these things implemented to people too. That too is an emerging science.
Question here, and then we'll go to one in the back.
Robin Williams, ABC, Australia. Robert, we know that the testing of drugs missed whole numbers of population. Lots of women, for example, they may do something pesky like being pregnant. Oh, what is the disparity with the evidence of what you might, have you found any disparities that show you that you really need to have a representative population if you're testing these drugs?
Yeah, I think that the literature is interesting. I think that is evolving and emerging, but there are definitely some that really point to disparities. Now, the interesting thing is, you would look at the U.S. system and sort of say, yeah, well, that's just disparities, it's because our system is kind of messed up. But, I've been to other places, including in Africa, including in Cuba. And the same argument I made there about what are your disparities? What data do you collect? How do you actually know that 10 miles away from here, right? Even in Cuba. Now, I will tell you that there's a lot of amazing things. In fact, we were one of the first programs that actually did something really nuts, right? We, under the Obama administration, we actually had, with the Ministry of Health of Cuba, embedded a group of their doctors and scientists on the south side of Chicago with us, and then asked the question, what would you do in the context of implementing your programs that are working in Cuba and other places? And, how would you do that on the south side of Chicago, right? That's just a different way of sort of thinking. What we've actually discovered is that same question that you ask about the data, most people are making assumptions, but people really have not analyzed their data on a granulated level to be able to figure out that there really are disparities sometimes in your own backyard.
John Kerry, freelancer. Dr. Edwards, can you explain a bit more how you protect marketing rights without patents? It would seem like, say you found a new target in Parkinson's, that would be all open source. A drug company could just take that and patent their approach to that target.
So in the world of drug discovery, when you make a medicine, you get a patent on the medicine. It's a composition of matter patent, as it were. And that lasts 20 years after you file the patent. And customarily in a long trial like neuroscience, it takes a long time. You'll have 5 to 7 years, 10 years left in your patent. On average, about 10. After your drug is approved, the data, the clock starts ticking on the proprietary nature of your data. So in America, it's 5 years for a small molecule. It's, I think, 12 for an antibody at one of these so-called biologics. And the way that generics enter the market to try and compete on your compound, right, which is really what marketing or a patent is for, the way they do that is they're required by the FDA, for example, to show equivalency to your data. To do that, they need to see your data, but they can't for 5 years. So even if they sued and overturned the patent, which you're allowed to by law, you would have no mechanism to enter the market because you're not allowed, you won't be able to see the data. You'd have to run the entire trial over again. So in practice, you only sue when you can enter the market after the data. So that tells the data become public. So that really tells you in the real world, data exclusivity is a stronger way to keep generics away than the patent. Because you can sue and overturn the patent, that data is granted by the government and it keeps people away. In fact, there's like 40 or 30 drugs that have been approved over the last 2 decades with no patent in the Orange Book. It's just the data that keep the market away. But no one's actually started a drug discovery project saying that's going to be our objective. And the whole point of not patenting is we can start talking about our science and sharing our science. As soon as there's nothing wrong with a patent per se, right? Because it's a way to disclose. But before you patent, you have to keep everything a secret. So I can't talk to you without a legal agreement in place. Now my friend at Nebraska wants to help. Hold it, we got to get the lawyers involved first. What happens if blah, 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 right? But if you have this zone of, okay, we're just putting the public domain, you can collaborate like this. And that in practice, this is what's really happening. We're getting contributions from all over. You know, one of these secrecy agreements between universities even takes 6 to 9 months.
Hello, my name's Kerry Calderbang. I'm a freelancer, and my past life was a registered nurse. And my question to you is, what are your policies about once you've got your drug into the clinical trial and it's passed, what are your policies regarding drug interaction with other drugs? And the only reason I'm saying this is because as a registered nurse and working in aged care, which made me really realise I needed to get out, was that doctors told us to give these people these drugs, but we had to crush them all together and mix them in jam and shove them in. And it was just, I just couldn't do it anymore. But I want to know if the policies are even looking this far down the line of basically the people that need the drugs are getting them so mixed up they're creating another drug, in my view. So I'd like to know what you think.
So how this is an implementation thing, right? So once the medicines are on the market, it's as it were, a free-for-all. And I can only argue and make the case that more transparency and openness in how the drugs are administered, how the data are collected, and how the data are shared will be able to shed some light on the complexities of drug-drug interaction, because as I say, comorbidities later in life, everybody's on multiple things, and it's impossible to test it. No company has the self-interest in checking it because they're only going to find bad things. And so as a society, the more we share the data about the science that I do, the implementation, or even the downstream monitoring, the more effective and the more safer the site and more equitable the site is going to be. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I have a rich fantasy life, and I think it's all going to be happy.
Question in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I'm Karina. I'm from Lehigh University. My question is, if and when these drugs are created, what would the process look like for ensuring that underserved communities receive and continue to receive access to those drugs?
So I guess it's me. And so what we've created is these companies that are owned by a charity. So you know how Paul Newman started the salad dressing company? And he started the company to give money away, right? The company's a for-profit company. It makes a nice product. It employs people. It contributes to economic development, which is what our government wants. But at the end of the day, all the post-tax profit goes into the Newman Foundation to give away. Why can't we make a drug company like that? There's a whole host of professors and clinicians, and I'm sure if I walked over here, Dr. Winn, and said, hey, I have a compound I'd like you to test, guess what? It might be a medicine. If it is, we're going to give the money away. We're going to charge as low as we can. He'd say, I'm in. I don't have to pay him anything. You can publish. You can do anything you want. There's like thousands of us out there like that. They just, it's not true that everyone's in it to try and make a lot of money. The professoriate, by and large, are a bunch of communists, right? And so we will contribute. Our salaries are paid by the governments, are this. So what we will do is when an asset goes forward, owned by this corporation, owned 100% by a corporation that's a charity, we can impose affordable pricing on the manufacturer. Say, when you license the period of exclusivity in the market, right? So you have the right to sell this and you have 10 years of marketing rights, but we'll negotiate the lowest price possible and then we'll give it to the highest bidder. And an organization in Geneva, DNDi, which is the organization that was spun out of the Doctors Without Borders with their Nobel Prize money that makes neglected disease drugs, those are the deals it does. It invents a medicine, gets it to market, and then licenses it to a manufacturer imposing affordable pricing. So we're not inventing a new deal structure. It's just the important thing is to completely control the asset when you're licensing it.
I would also tell you that policy matters, right? When you think about the NIH and other organizations like that, there are policies that strongly encourage the enrollment, for example, of women or those who are underrepresented in what we call biomedical research on those clinical trials. No such thing usually is true with this sort of big pharma companies. You have immunotherapy trials right now where you have zero, I wish I were making this up, zero underrepresented in biomedical research people even on the trial. What then can you extrapolate from those data? Second, not to complicate one's life, but let's take race out of this. Because I think that your zip code, your ZNA as we call it, the zip code or neighborhood of association, is a particularly stronger indicator of things of how you're going to respond to drugs, and yet, where's those data? We haven't even really thought about even collecting those types of data. You can have a 59-year-old African-American woman in, the south side of Chicago who we put on clinical trial who's not responsive to something, and then what do we say now? Oh, well, it's just, well, she's African-American. But you don't know that. If you believe in the microbiome, if you believe in epigenetics, then we still don't have really enough, there's missing data, as I call it, and in the 21st century, I'm aspiring and hoping, pushing us all, that as we're even thinking about our clinical trials and beyond the enrollment, that we're thinking about other data as well that might actually have effects that we're not even looking at and we're not even clued into. That's the reason why you want to have diverse people on your populations, and not just diverse in racial ethnicity, but from areas, right? Because sometimes the place where you live really does matter. And in fact, I've made the argument that two sisters that come from a well-to-do neighborhood that then grow up as we all do and move apart, and one lives in a very rich, resource-rich area and another one lives in a very resource-poor area, may not respond the same way. And yet this is the hope really of precision medicine, that we are really being precise, not just in the molecular sort of level, but what are the things that the environment and other things are actually having on those too. So to your point, which I know is a long-winded way of saying policy, but I'll get back to that NIH and others, people are encouraged to do that. Big pharma companies and others are there's not even a smack on the wrist. It's just, yeah, okay, whatever. And I think that, again, we have to think about, if we're talking about global citizens, we have to really be global in our approaches as well.
I have an addendum, right? We must be careful not to demonize pharma, right?
Correct.
We've made medicine, the discovery of medicine, a capitalist endeavor. Their folks have the obligation, they interpret the obligation anyway, to maximize profits for their shareholders. If you complicate trials, I don't believe this, but they can make the argument, if we complicate trials, it'll be more costly, and therefore it'll reduce our profit, our quarterly earnings or whatever it is. And so, we could, all of us, march, and we all hold stock in all these companies, we could march to their AGMs and say, make less money. But we don't, right? And so we're sort of intertwined with this. So policy is the answer, of course, because it is a regulated environment, or, invent a new way.
Question here, and then, yep.
Quick follow-up on that. I assume you've all heard of Michael Laufer. I'm Tom Keenan with Business Edge again. And Michael Laufer is the guy who comes to conferences like Hackers on Planet Earth, throwing out handfuls of drugs that he made for 45 cents that are being sold for $400. And his idea is drug torrenting. So just as people torrent videos and so on. And I guess you all think it's a terrible idea. Marya's already shaking her head. But since you made the remark about Proust being commies, do you see any upside to that idea? Torrenting of drugs as in making the recipe, if you will, available.
We've just seen a whole series of recalls of drugs in the cardiovascular drugs because the manufacturers made a very small change in their process, which happened to result in generation of a small amount of a carcinogenic byproduct. And the thought of there's certainly we have a lot of experience with people making their own recreational drugs, and that experience is that those products generally don't have very good quality control. So there certainly that is you know, I can see that angle, and I can see the desire to shame a company that buys a patent and then cranks the price up by a factor of 16 or 200, you know. Yeah. But as a societal policy, that does not seem like the way to go.
Just note a fact, he didn't buy the patent, he got data exclusivity.
Language.
Joan Willans, freelance. Does the FDA have a formal apparatus for going after fake drugs? And if not, why not? Or is there any other branch of government that would look after what is essentially criminal activity?
The U.S. FDA has a pretty effective legislative or regulatory teeth. So, for example, there was a case where an Indian company called Ranbaxy was shown to have been producing bad quality products. There was a whistleblower involved, and the company was fined $500 million. So it's pretty effective, and FDA now maintains an office in India and an office in China. My main activities are not in the U.S. My main activities are in developing countries where the regulatory, let's just say that there's not a lot of burdensome regulation going on. Okay, and so the result is that companies can satisfy regulatory requirements to get their product onto shelves in the country, and then often there's little follow-up. So they submit 500 samples that are tested, that are proved to be of good quality, and then after that, they may ship material that doesn't meet those standards. And so the issue is global regulatory setup. There is no uniform global regulation. There's no black hats out there, you know, that are looking over the global pharma. And it's a real concern because more than 80% of the APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredients that go into drugs used in the U.S. are manufactured outside the U.S. And once you start getting bad quality products into the supply chain, then all kinds of possibilities exist for them sneaking into more regulated markets.
Marya may have to leave for another event, but would you have time for one more question if needed? Okay, I don't. Did we have another question here? Okay, all right, okay. All right. Thank you so much, Marya. We really appreciate it. We want to make sure you can get to your next event if you need to. Okay, we can.
So, Dr. Edwards, there may be thousands of you that don't want to make a lot of money, but ever since warfarin, universities have seen huge dollar amounts from licensing patents developed by the university scientists. Do you see much resistance, you yourself or your colleagues working on these things, from universities and their tech transfer offices that really do want to follow the traditional business model?
It's a great question, but let's start with the restating of the facts. Those of us lucky enough to be in academia do make a lot of money and enough compared to most people on the planet, right? There's obscene amounts and enough, okay? So many of us think we make enough. That's for one. Second, the examples of warfarin are very few and far between. There is a handful of universities, I think I last counted 6, that make more than 10% of their total income from licensing. The last information that was public, all the Canadian universities combined made $57 million, this is 2010, made $57 million in licensing income and royalties, but they spent 55 to get there. A net of $2 million on a 12, at the time it was a little over $10 billion R&D budget, okay? And so it's a canard that universities in toto use this as an income mechanism. What they don't count is the treacle they put in the system and what the opportunities lost by adopting these rather secretive and transactional ways of doing science. And so far, the universities in which we have laboratories, McGill, UNC, Oxford, Karolinska, Frankfurt, they're perfectly happy with this, give it away. I think they want to do it. But that said, they're a little bit schizophrenic because they also measure people on how many patents you have, as if that's a metric that matters.
How important is it to the open science route that you're going that all research papers be open science? I'm thinking about Plan S and things like that.
Yeah, so as you all probably know, you guys pay for all our science. Then we review it ourselves, so professors take the time to make sure the science is good, and then when it's published, you pay for it again. And it's sort of completely ludicrous. So the European Commission has come up with so-called Plan S, which says that all the research that they fund will have to go into journals that everyone can read. Not journals which have a mixed model where, you know, like in the websites and some of the news organizations where you pay to see some and you can see others open. No, they say it has to all be open. And so there's a movement going that we paid for the research, we should be able to read the research. And I think that's going to overtake. But that said, what happens is that still doesn't stop people from patenting and not publishing. And that also is post facto. Once the research is done, you could see it. It commonly will take maybe 4 years, maybe from the start of a project to when it's done. You know, and that's more than the lifespan of an ALS patient, for example. So we need to get science out faster.
Okay. Thank you so much. If we don't have any other questions, thanks to our speakers. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.